Welcome YouTube. Thank you for watching. This is just my introduction video to my Linux series, and this is Infected Bytes, and sit back and enjoy. So what is Linux? Linux is an open source operating system. By being open source means you can look at the source code and see how it's written and change it, alter it, whatever you want. Open source is just a legal term. It's just how you look at the license. Windows, you cannot look at the source code. Linux gives you freedom of your computer. Nearly all Linux distributions are free. Linux is free to customize even at the source code. I'm not going to tell you that Linux is virus proof completely. There are viruses for Linux, but they're very few and far between. I found a statistic that 90% of all malware targets Windows, malware being viruses, Trojans, etc. Only 1% went to Mac and Linux. That means less than 1% of all the viruses written are actually going to Linux. Pretty good statistic. So why Linux? Linux gives you the freedom to customize your operating system to whatever you need it to do. Linux will also increase system performance. By that I mean Linux is not greedy on its resources. It doesn't hog it like Windows does. Windows takes a lot to run. It takes a lot of resources. If you get a Linux distribution, you configure it good and solid, it can become extremely stable. If you're wanting to learn IT security, learning Linux is a must. Also, learning Linux is a good platform to learn information technology. So you have Linux, but then you have distribution is a version of Linux. Main distributions, for example, are Ubuntu, Arch Linux, Debian, Slackware, Fedora, OpenSUSE, and Red Hat. These are just some examples of distributions. Basically, a distribution is a version of that Linux. Linux is in between your hardware and your software. It communicates between the hardware and the software. It's just the kernel. So how do distros necessarily work? Well, you got Linux as a kernel, and then you got a base system like Ubuntu or Arch Linux, and then you have a customization on top of that. For like Ubuntu, someone's taken Ubuntu and they made it like Backtrack or Mint. These are Ubuntu, but they specialized in a certain area or just changed it. And so Ubuntu, you got like Backtrack, Mint, Lubuntu. Arch Linux, you have what's called Archbang, Archbone, Archherd, etc. And Fedora has spins, and you can get into more detailed if you want. So what distribution should you choose? Well, this depends on what you want. What do you want out of your computer? And here's just a couple examples. If you're going strictly security, a good distribution would be Backbox, Backtrack. These are just specialized for that area. Or do you want everyday all-around system, like you're just a student that wants a free operating system but doesn't want to go too deep? Mint and Ubuntu are really great for that. So what distribution should you choose for being a beginner, and where do I start? Well, what distributions I recommend, I highly recommend Linux Mint. I really love Linux Mint. That was my first operating system I used, and I really liked it. But you also have Ubuntu, Puppy Linux, and PinGuyOS. These are all good distributions. And what you also see as like advanced distributions are also known hardcore distributions. These are like Arch Linux, Slackware, also Gen 2 could be in here. These are really, if you want, these create a really steep learning curve, really good. But if you really want to learn Arch Linux, Slackware, I highly recommend you learning Ubuntu and getting comfortable with the Mint and the beginning distributions before coming and then trying out the hardcore distributions. Just because when you install Arch Linux or Slackware, when you get done, it's just a command line. It's just you have to install your own GUI, your own desktop environment, and all that sort. You'll need to learn how Linux works first before moving on to the advanced distros. I recommend you learning Ubuntu, actually learning it, learning how it works, not just playing around with the GUI, but get your feet wet with the terminal. I recommend in between 4 to 6 months before you can start learning these advanced distros. But this just depends on you and your learning ability. Some concepts you need to know when using Linux is what's root. Root is the highest level authority on a Linux system. Basically, if you're in root, you have all control over it. That gives you ultimate permissions. You'll need to know what a package manager is, and you need to understand this difference. It's different between distributions. Arch Linux uses Pacman, and Ubuntu uses Symtac. And you'll just have to do some research on what distribution and learn how to use them. Also, you need to know what a terminal is. And I will post a video on basic terminal commands at a later date. By the time you're watching this, it could already be out. So, well, how would you learn Linux? What would be the best way to learn Linux? Quickest, best, way. Personally, how I learned it is I got rid of Windows and installed Linux on my PC and dove right in. But not everyone has that ability to do that. But that way I had to force myself to learn alternatives and get everything I needed to get done in a different way. But you don't necessarily have to do that. You can do a couple other things. You can dual boot your PC, basically have 2 partitions, or you can do what's called VirtualBox or VMware virtualization. Basically, virtualization will let you run an operating system in a virtual environment. So you can run Linux in Windows in a separate window, or vice versa. Dual booting allows you to, when you boot up your PC, you can go into Windows or you can go into Linux. It'll give you a choice. I recommend this one if you want an alternative than just erasing Windows and starting over. But I want you to realize if you're dual booting and you're playing around with it, make sure you do some research and do it correctly, and make sure you back up your computer before starting that process, or there's a good chance you can lose everything. Also realize you can only have 4 partitions on your hard drive at a time. So make sure that your Windows doesn't have a saved partition of itself saved on there. So, alright, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and thank you for watching.